I'm hoping you can all hear me. Hello and welcome, and it's lovely to see you all here. My name's Clare, as you know, and as I think Natty just said, I'm the author of 4 historical fiction novels. And today I'm going to chat about the link between local history and fiction, and how a strong sense of place can have an impact on how an author develops a story. And in particular, we're going to be looking at how my adopted home city of Nottingham, here in the Midlands, helped inspire my 3rd book, The Night Raid, which is set in a local gun factory at the height of the Second World War. And as you can probably hear, I'm not originally from Nottingham. I don't have much of a Nottingham accent. I was brought up in Devon, but I married a soldier, and over the course of his career in the British Army, we kept on getting pinged back to the barracks here on the outskirts of Nottingham. So whilst we were being sent all over the place, from Northern Ireland to Nepal, it was Nottingham that we ended up in at the end of my husband's time in the military, mainly because all my 3 children were settled in schools here. But what I realised as I moved off the cocoon environment of the army barracks and into Civvy Street was that even though I had spent quite a bit of time living in the area, I really knew very little about the real Nottingham at all. And so I suppose it was only a matter of time before my curiosity about my new home made its way into one of my books. So I'm going to move on now. Here we go. So as I mentioned, my books have dealt largely with the Second World War, and my first, The Gunner Girl, was set primarily in London. My second, The English Agent, was set mostly in Paris. But for my third, I decided to come much closer to home. And The Night Raid is set almost entirely in Nottingham. And this came about partly because I wanted to find out more about my new hometown, but also because I developed a fascination with the famous war artist Laura Knight, who grew up in Nottingham. And I'd seen an exhibition of her work at the Genogli Gallery on the university campus, and also paintings of hers that are on permanent display at Nottingham Castle and in the Gallery Cafe at Lakeside. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. Here we go. Here's Laura. And often as a writer, if you develop a little bit of an obsession with something, a character, a location, or a historical event, and Laura Knight and wartime Nottingham were the seeds that grew into The Night Raid. And some of you might know about Laura Knight, but some of you might be less familiar. So I'll just give you a brief sort of potted overview of her life history. Laura Johnson, as she then was born in Long Eaton and brought up in Nottingham. She went to art college in Nottingham, where she met her fellow artist and future husband, Harold Knight. She left Nottingham as a young woman and never returned here to live, preferring instead artist communities in Staithes on the North Yorkshire coast and St Ives in Cornwall. She gained celebrity status and became a Dame of the British Empire in the interwar years, between the First and Second World Wars, for her paintings of circus performers, gypsies, and ballerinas. But what fascinated me was that she'd been a war artist, and that was an arena which I previously thought of as an exclusively a male preserve. I thought war artists were like soldiers, that they were mostly men. And my debut novel, The Gunner Girl, was written following the, to me, revelation that there were women soldiers in World War II. And my second novel came about when I discovered that a young woman had been parachuted into occupied France to undertake sabotage operations against the Nazis. And so then this realization that there were women war artists working during World War II, although it was a quieter discovery, it was still a revelation, and it piqued my interest. So I began by thinking about how this famous war artist and her links to Nottingham could inspire a story. And I started by visiting the house where she'd grown up, which is still there. So Laura moved to Nottingham at the age of 3 and lived at the edge of what's now the Forest Recreation Ground at Ethel Villas, number 9 Knoll Street, and there's a blue plaque there these days. As local historians will know, the recreation ground was originally part of Sherwood Forest. It was home of the Forest Football Club from 1865 to 1898, when they moved to the City Ground, and they're now known as Nottingham Forest, of course. From 1773, it was also the site of a horse racing track, and from her bedroom window, Laura could watch the races and the punters parading in their race day finery, as you can see from these old photos. And for those of you who are local to Nottingham, the Forest tram stop is right by Laura Knight's childhood home, and there's also a tram named after her. So if you time it right, you can get Laura herself to drop you at her front door, which is quite nice. So as a stepping off point for my research, I took the tram to the Forest and I walked back along past Nottingham High School for Girls, where Laura went to school and also briefly taught. And if you follow Waverley Road into the city centre, it's a bit of a Laura Knight trail because you also pass the Arboretum and the Art College, which she attended and where she met her husband. So some of you will know those areas very well. And if you haven't, it's quite nice to go and have a look. So moving on, here we go. When researching my novel, I tried to find out as much as I could about Laura Knight's work as a war artist in World War II. And the War Artists Advisory Committee, headed by Kenneth Clarke, the art historian and broadcaster, who later created the 1969 TV series Civilization, which maybe some of you remember. And the War Artists Advisory Committee was set up at the start of World War II with the aim of compiling a comprehensive record of Britain throughout the war, and he headed it up. And Laura Knight was one of the artists commissioned by the committee. So during the war, she painted many portraits of young women engaged in war work, such as on the anti-aircraft balloons, which you can see in this poster here. And loads of her paintings are still held at the Imperial War Museum's archives, but occasionally you can find them on public display. There was actually an exhibition of her work in Milton Keynes last year. So I don't know if any of you have seen any of her pictures, but as we go along, there's one that you might have seen and you might recognise. So here we go. This one. So probably the most famous of Laura Knight's wartime portraits, and the one you may have seen before, is this one, Ruby Loftus screwing a breech ring. And I discovered that for this particular painting, Laura spent several weeks living with the young woman who worked in a South Wales armaments factory. And one of the things Laura talked about in her autobiographies, she wrote 2 of them and I've read them both, and she talked about how important it was for her to get to know her subjects in order to be able to paint them well. And for her, this meant spending many hours getting to know them before embarking on the final painting. So you can see here, she's chatting to her subjects, and she would go and sort of install herself in the factory and watch them work and talk to them on their breaks and really sort of get under their skin before she did the portrait, so she could get a sense of character coming out in the painting. And this then got me thinking. I'd already thought, okay, Nottingham, Laura Knight, I like all of this. I want to do something along these lines. So I thought, what if Laura returned to her hometown during World War II in order to paint factory girls, just as she'd done in South Wales? And what if, through the process of getting to know her sitters, she ended up discovering something about her own past? Now, of course, this didn't actually happen, but it could have done. And that's the sort of trick with historical fiction, is to take something that didn't happen, but given the historical context, could have done. So you kind of slip the fiction in under cover of the history that's known about. It seemed like a good starting point for my story anyway. So at the time, I wasn't sure whether or not there had been arms factories in Nottingham at the time, but with the magic of Google, I quickly discovered that yes, there had been, in fact, a huge gun factory in the city. So it was completely plausible that Laura could have, although she didn't, could have been asked to come to Nottingham to paint the factory girls. So I had to do a little bit more research then to find out what life would have been like for young women who'd been conscripted to work in the factories during World War II. And there's a lovely old propaganda film which you can still find. It starring Patricia Rock and Gordon, I can't remember his name. You recognise him. He was in The Great Escape, and he was also in Minder. I can't remember his name. But anyway, they're both in it. And it's that's a really nice one to watch. Patricia Rock. And I looked at posters, I looked at magazine covers, I looked at photographs from the time. If you go onto the Imperial War Museums, they've got loads of archives of old propaganda photographs from World War II, and they're really useful for research because you can just pick up lots of little details from there. And at the time, the girls or the young women who would have gone to factories would have tended to be working class girls. It was interesting because although young women who were unmarried were conscripted, if they didn't have children, they were conscripted at the age of 18 from 1941, late 1941 onwards. But there tended to be a little bit of a sort of class structure. So the really posh young women would go into the Navy, which had this fabulous uniform, and everybody wanted to join the Navy because of this super uniform that made you look really slim and lovely. And then the sort of more middle class girls would end up going into maybe the ATS, and it was the working class girls who just got shunted off to the factories. Which is quite interesting. I hadn't realised, that was another one of those things that came up through the research. I hadn't realised that the class element permeated into conscription for women as well. So, better move on, hadn't we? Next slide. So after having decided that the story would definitely centre around Laura Knight coming to paint the factory girls in Nottingham during World War II and the relationship between her and her sitters, I needed to do a bit more research before I started to write. So here I've just got a selection of the books I read when I was researching the Night Raid, and I just wanted to show you this one so that you can see, and this is only a selection of how much, when people write historical fiction, which if any of you do, you'll know that a lot goes into it that you're not necessarily aware of when you're reading a book, but there are all these other influences that go in, lots of other fiction and lots of other factual books. So anyway, once I'd done a bit of background reading, I began to shape my novel, and it was time to hit the pavements again. So now we're going to go on a little bit of a tour around Nottingham and discover the places that found their way into my book. The historian Antonia Fraser coined the phrase optical research about this sort of research, where you think you want to write about somewhere and you just go out and have a look around and get a feel for the place. And sometimes I'd go out and I'd know that I wanted to include a piece of action in my plot, but like a film director, I'd need a location to put it in. And other times I just would come across a place and think, that's a really evocative place. I need to put that in the book. And I'd build a scene around it. So it happens sort of from both sides. But here we are, we're in the middle of Nottingham, which any of you who are from the city will recognise. An old photo, obviously. The Exchange Building and Old Market Square would have been quite new in wartime because they were rebuilt and regenerated in the late 1920s when the old marketplace moved out of the city centre. And I knew I couldn't have a book set in Nottingham without having one scene at least set in the Old Market Square because it's such an iconic location. So if you've read the book, or if you're planning on reading the book, you can look out for that. Then moving on, we're walking out of Old Market Square now and crossing the street, going up the street a bit. And I don't know if any of you recognise either of these places. They're sort of on either side of Old Market Square. The Flying Horse is the one on the left there, the white sort of gabled building. And some of you, if you're from Nottingham, might remember it as a pub. I think it was a pub until the 1980s, I think. And famously, Richard Branson had a drink in there with the Sex Pistols when they won a libel case in Nottingham courts in 1977 or something. Anyway, that doesn't make its way into the book. The Flying Horse Inn is more than 500 years old, and it was established in the late 1400s and only finally closed its doors to drinkers in 1989 when it was converted into a shop, and it's now the frontage of the Flying Horse Shopping Arcade. But I discovered that the Flying Horse was the pub where the Polish airmen liked to converge on their nights off, because there was an RAF training school at Hucknall Airport, which from 1941 onwards trained Polish airmen. So discovering not just that there was an RAF training base nearby, but also crucially, where the airman could be found in town was critical for a particular scene in the night raid, which again, if you've read the book, you'll know. I love it when you discover facts like this because they really help you to imagine yourself in a scene. I knew I had to have one character, this one was called Vi, going to look for a young Polish airman she'd met at a dance. It really helped me to know where she would have gone to look for him. And even though you know it's not real, you kind of want that authenticity. And for this particular part of the plot, I went to the coffee shop that's there, near there now. And I sat outside with my latte, looking up at the flying horse frontage, and just let my imagination go. And I wrote the scene there, and somehow being in that place to write the scene just really helped me get in the flow, and it was really good fun. You have these, sometimes writing's hard work and sometimes it's just a joy, and that was one of the days when it was a real joy. And then the other building, which is the other side of the square, and you probably can't recognise it because it's got the scaffolding in front of it, but it's Bromley House Library, which again, some of you may know because I know that the book festival visited the library this week. Here we go. So here's a better photo of it. And there, so you can see the entrance there next to the Bernardo's charity shop, and then inside the lovely old buildings with there's the Meridian line there where the old gentlemen used to set their watches from at midday. In the other photo, love Bromley House Library. So it was new to me when I began writing the night raid. Because I was fairly new to Nottingham, I hadn't heard of it. But again, it was somewhere that had to find its way into the book. So whilst with the flying horse, I knew what scene I wanted to write, and I had to scout for the right location. With Bromley House Library, I had no particular scene in mind, but once I visited, I knew I had to include it somehow in the book. And the photo doesn't really do it justice, but as you know, if you've ever visited, or if you've seen, or if you watch the footage from Mondays, whenever it was that the book festival went to the library, you'll know that it's just such an evocative location. It's from the outside, it looks like quite a nondescript building, but inside it's a bit of a TARDIS, and it's a real historical gem. So a bit about Bromley House, in case you don't know, founded in 1816 and remains one of the country's oldest private lending libraries. And it's a beautifully preserved Grade 2 listed Georgian townhouse with a walled garden. As soon as I set foot inside, I knew I had to set a scene there, but I didn't know what. A helpful librarian who's still there, called Amy, printed me out some details of the library's wartime history. And I discovered two things. Firstly, that the library had been used to house the local fire watchers, on hand with stirrup pumps and sand to quickly extinguish any incendiary bombs falling on Angel Row. And secondly, that there was once a librarian who left her employment in mysterious circumstances. And there was a list of all the librarians employed and leaving employment. And there was always a reason given as to why the librarians left, like marriage or retirement or moving to another job. But one woman left in the early 1940s with no reason given. And I thought, oh, I wonder what scandal is behind that. So I used these two facts and this sort of sanctified feeling of the library to help spin one of the scenes in the night raid. And if you've read the book, you'll know which scene I'm talking about. So here we go, we've come out of the library, we're coming out of the town centre. I don't know if you'll recognise any of these places. If you're from Nottingham, you might do. If you're not, you won't. So it was in fact my hairdresser who told me about the Park Estate. Again, it was new to me because I wasn't from Nottingham. And once I'd visited, I thought, yeah, I think I've got to have the Park Estate in this book as well. So the Park Estate was originally, as some of you might know, a deer park attached to Nottingham Castle, which stands above it on the limestone cliffs. And in Victorian times, it was turned into a private housing estate for wealthy industrialists with more than 300 homes, but within the enclosure. And then a tunnel, which you can see there, was blasted through the rock to link the posh new homes, giving access to horse-drawn carriages between the estate and the shops and theatres in the city centre. It was designated a conservation area in 1969, apparently. So I loved hunting down the hidden tunnel, which is now tucked away behind a car park off the Derby Road, and you can still get to it that way, but it looks like it's a dead end, but you sort of skirt your way beneath a nondescript building and can get through it that way. So I spent some happy times wandering around the estate with my dog, actually, and imagining where characters might live or meet, or what, or where they might visit. And I also realised that the city hospital used to overlook the park. I mean, obviously now there's the city hospital on the outskirts of Nottingham and there's the QMC in the centre. But before they built the QMC, the main hospital used to overlook the park. And this too found its way into the night raid, and might not have occurred to me had I not put in the footwork and noticed the link between the two locations, the park estate and the hospital. So a sense of place and the geographical coincidence can really help develop a plot or inform a character. So let's walk on to a different part of Nottingham now. Here we go. We know where this is. Here we are at the railway station. And this was one of the scenes where I knew that the location. I'd been to the station before, but I really needed help fixing it in my mind for a scene. So I went there and just sat on the platform for a while. I mean, people must have thought I was potty, but I literally just kind of sat down with the trains coming and going with my notebook and just had a bit of a think. I don't think I even wrote very much there. I just sort of sat and had a bit of a think. But it did help. Originally, apparently, there were 3 stations in Nottingham. I didn't know that. I discovered this in my research. But this is the only one that remains. It was built in 1848 and rebuilt in 1904. And although we don't have steam trains anymore, because of the architecture and the feel of the station is quite similar to how it would have been in the 1940s, it was still worth going and sort of sucking up the atmosphere. And also there's always something about like stations like ports and airports, there's always that sort of tension and excitement with places where people are arriving and leaving, because there's always a reason why they're arriving and leaving, and sometimes that reason can be quite exciting and life-changing. So it's quite nice to go to these places anyway as a writer and just let your imagination go a little bit. So let's hop on a train and go out of Nottingham a little bit. Here we go. So this is Trent Valley Sailing Club, which is actually on the outskirts of Long Eaton. And when I was writing The Night Raid, my children used to have sailing lessons here. So I used to go there quite a lot, and it's this lovely old building. So I just, sailing clubs, it's at the confluence of the Trent and the Soar. And I just wanted to have a countryside location because a lot of the book is set sort of in the factory and in the city centre, and I wanted to have a little bit of a variety in there. And apparently the clubhouse was briefly used as a hospital in World War II. And if you visit and look at the honour boards, you'll see there's a gap in the names there for when it wasn't used as a sailing club and it was commandeered as a hospital. So one of the things is set there just because it's a great location, and I wanted somewhere sort of a little bit romantic at one point, and it seemed like a nice place to take my protagonist. And here we go, let's hop back on the train and come back to the other side of Nottingham now. Here we go, we're a bit closer into Nottingham. We've come back on the train and we're in Attenborough. And I live within walking distance of Attenborough Village and the nature reserve. So it was sort of an easy place to go to get inspiration. And it was also nice to find out a little bit more about what was literally on my doorstep. So I've got some scenes that I've set in the churchyard, and I've got scenes set at the Attenborough railway station. And there's a lovely house called Cloud House, which I didn't know the history of the house, but I liked it as a location, and I used it as a setting for a mother and baby's home as well. So if I got stuck writing scenes, sometimes I would just go out for a walk with the dog and think, okay, and once you're there, then you can fix something in your mind. So here we go. Back on the train, back into town. Oh, other side of Nottingham. Here we go. So I don't know any of you know where we are now, but we've come across the toll bridge and we're in Wilford Village. So Wilford Village and the toll bridge are both mentioned by Laura Knight in her autobiographies. And she talks about going on painting trips there with her mother as a little girl. That even though they lived on the other side of Nottingham, they used to walk across Nottingham and go to Wilford and paint. And I'd found myself imagining how Laura Knight might bring some of the factory girls out of the factory and perhaps take them and paint them on the banks of the River Trent, or just take them out to get to know them a bit there. Laura Knight actually got married in another Nottinghamshire village, Westleague, but for the purposes of the night raid, I've conflated the two. And Wilford is one of those places that I wouldn't necessarily have visited had I not been researching the book, but I'm really glad I did, because it's like the Park Estate, another one of those hidden gems that Nottingham keeps to itself a little bit. I mean, Nottingham has a history of being an industrial city, like a mill town for Nottingham lace and for rally bicycles and making Clare cigarettes and Boots the chemist. But there are these lovely, pretty semi-rural pockets that juxtapose with the gritty city feel. And I wanted to get both of those into the book if I could. And it was just such fun going around and finding out about them. So here we're in the Meadows now. And if anyone's from Nottingham and of a certain age, you might remember that there used to be a gun factory in what's now NG2, and it's been demolished and transformed into a business park. And lots of the housing in the Meadows has been rebuilt too. So the area's got a really different feel to how it would have been in wartime. But for most of the 20th century, there were 2 railway lines serving the area and a huge gun factory. During World War I, the factory on the site produced shells, but was later converted to gun production. And I almost didn't bother visiting because it seemed to have changed so much since World War II. But I'm really glad I did, because not only did I find a site beside the River Lean to set a particular conversation that 2 of my characters needed to have, this was really good, I also happened to hear some men on the tram reminiscing about how the windows in their houses used to shake when they tested the guns at the factory back in the day. And it was pure coincidence that they happened to be talking about it. And it was a little bit of detail that I could then incorporate into the book, which came as a bonus. So it was definitely worth going out, putting in the legwork and finding these little snippets of research. So here we go. A little bit more. Just prior to World War II, the factory was remodelled to become a Royal Ordnance factory to produce Bofors and anti-aircraft guns. And at the height of the war, as many as 14,000 people worked at the factory, mostly women who'd been conscripted to do war work. After the war, the factory continued to make weapons, including the development of the Centurion tank, but was finally closed for good in 2001. And during the war, the factory would have been surrounded by sort of Coronation Street type terrace housing, much of which was rebuilt in the 70s. And during the war, the factory roof was painted to look like terrace rooftops to try and camouflage it from bombing raids. Although Nottingham did suffer its own blitz, there's no evidence that the gun factory was hit itself. So the night raid I write about in the book, The Night Raid, is entirely fictitious. But it's another example, like the fiction that Laura Knight painted, The Factory Workers, of something that didn't actually happen, but could have done. So it's not accurate, but it's authentic because the circumstances meant it was a possibility, although it wasn't a reality. So coming back now, here we go, back in Old Market Square. One of the reviewers of The Night Raid calls it a love letter to a city, and in a way it was, because throughout the course of research charms of Nottingham, it's not got the dynamism of London, the sex appeal of Paris, or the dark undercurrents of Berlin, which have been other settings for my fiction, but I love discovering the hidden history of this city, which I'm now proud to call my home. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Has anyone got any questions? Shall I stop sharing my screen now? How do I do that? Stop sharing, then you can see me. Right. Hello. Anybody got any questions?
I think we have a question in the chat here.
The one in the chat. Oh, sorry, yes. I haven't looked at the chat. That's very bad, isn't it? Would you consider writing any other genre? Yes. Well, I sort of am. So the book that I've got out on submission at the moment, not the Mauritius book, but there's another book that I've written, which is a dual timeline one. So it's more like general historical fiction rather than a World War II saga drama. But the problem with that is that people know me for writing sort of World War II dramas. And so it's harder to find publishers who want something that's not World War II, because they think of my name associated to World War II. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm giving it a go, and we'll see what happens. But I'm not sure that I would write, crime or sci-fi or things like that. You tend to end up writing stuff that you enjoy reading. So yeah, I'm not sure that I'd stray too far from historical fiction. After all your research in Nottingham, do you have a favourite place? I quite like Hockley. What I find is the longer I live here, the more I discover and the more I like it. And I thought when we first moved here, I thought, oh, well, we've got to stay here because the children are in school, and then maybe we'll move somewhere else because Nottingham, it's a bit boring, Midlands town. Wouldn't I rather live in Devon, where I'm from, or maybe another part of the country where I've got friends or family? But now I really like it. There's so much. There are lots of theatres, and there's lovely restaurants, and there's a good art scene. And yeah, I mean, I live quite close to Beeston, and Beeston's just lovely now. So yeah, sure. Will you say more about your new book, please? Well, the one that's out on submission, so it's not with a publisher yet, so it's going around, it goes around to different publishers, is set in Zanzibar, post-war Zanzibar, so just right after VE Day, and also in 19th century Zanzibar, because I found a memoir of this Zanzibari princess from the 19th century, which was amazingly interesting. And so I've twisted a real life story into fiction, and yeah, mixed up these two women's lives are sort of wrapped around each other, and they come together at the end. And I don't really want to say any more than that, because you kind of have to read it. But there is a link. You do find out at the end there is a link between these two women who seem to be leading separate lives, but it all joins up. And it was really, yeah, Zanzibar was really nice to write about, because I visited there in my 20s and I've not been back since. And I wrote it during a lot of the book during lockdown, when we were all stuck at home. So it was nice to imagine myself miles away on a desert island in a different century. It was such fun. And I couldn't, for that one, I desperately wanted to do the optical research for that one, because it would have been lovely to go to Zanzibar and see these places and walk around. And what I had to do in the end was find a book of travel writing, which was published in the early 1950s, which was the closest I could get to the era I was writing about, and read. And also a guidebook from the 1950s to Zanzibar. So read what it would have been like in the mid 20th century and use that as my research, because I couldn't go and look around. So it was different for me. I do prefer go and visit places. Do you think you'd write another book based in Nottingham? I don't know. Do you know, I really love Nottingham, but I think in terms of selling it to a market, it's not very sexy. I think when people go to a bookshop and they pick up a book, they want it set in somewhere like London, Paris or Berlin. And actually, I loved writing this book, The Night Raid. I think it's one of the best things I've written, but it didn't sell as well as the others. And I think it's because it's not perceived as being as glamorous. So I'm not sure whether I would set another book in Nottingham or not, because with half an eye on getting published, I would have to think about my location were I to do it again. which isn't, you know, I don't want to do a disservice to Nottingham, but I think it's quite a hard sell. You write something about Paris and people, or Venice, and people, oh, they can't wait to buy it. But I think Nottingham's just a bit harder to sell. How important is representation of class in your novels? Well, I'm aware of it, I would say. I wouldn't say it's important, but I'm aware that it exists. I'm aware that if you're writing about mid-20th century Britain, that that inescapably that's going to enter into it. And when I wrote my debut novel, The Gunner Girl, I have 3 women from 3 different classes. So I have a working class young woman, an upper class young woman, and a middle class woman. And I wanted to bring them together because I wanted those experiences of different classes. And because wartime did that, when women were conscripted, they would then end up rubbing against people who had completely different lives and completely different backgrounds. And I think that was a really positive thing. And although we're not as, class isn't such a factor nowadays as it would have been then. I think if you're writing historical fiction, you have to be aware of it. And of course, it does still exist, but I don't think it's quite as rigid as it would have been. You've written about women's lives. Was that a deliberate choice? Yes, definitely. I think history is often still, despite everybody's best efforts, his story. And I think women often unintentionally get overlooked, and their voices get lost. And fiction can be a kind of quietly feminist way of bringing those voices back to the fore. And yes, definitely, I think that it's, even though there are romance elements to my books, they're not about the men, they're about the women and what they do. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, any more questions? Oh, one more there.
Oh, have you, or would you like to adapt your book? I would, you know, if someone came along and said they'd like to option one of my novels, I would crack open the champagne. I would love it. I would absolutely love it. But these things, it's all, yeah, it's a big old gamble. You can't make that happen. Somebody has to show an interest, and then they have to get the funding to have it made. So if it happens, that would be brilliant. I would love it. I could absolutely see The Gunner Girl as a Sunday night ITV drama. I could absolutely see The Escape as a bit of a weepy old film. Yeah, who wouldn't? It would be great. But I wouldn't do that myself because I'm not a screenwriter. But if someone else picked up one of my books, I'd jump for joy. It'd be fantastic.
But would you like to take active part in the process of making it? No,
I'd be happy to, because then it would be somebody else's vision. I think it's a different genre. It's not my genre. It's someone else's vision. If they want to monkey around with it, happy days. I think things get mixed up in the process. I take memoirs and diaries and oral history accounts, and I monkey about with them and turn them into fiction. If someone then wants to take my fiction and monkey about with it and turn it into a film or a TV drama, happy days, as long as they acknowledge that I was the stepping off point for the process. And it'd be nice to get paid for it as well. That would be nice. But yeah, I think if someone can take it forward creatively in any way they want, it's all in the mix. That's my thing, is remix. It's all, I think creativity just evolves and moves forward, and you can't keep a creative project to yourself. There's more questions here. When did you decide you wanted to be a writer? I kind of secretly wanted to be a writer, but didn't think I could, because I thought, when I was at school, I didn't know any writers, and I thought it was one of those things. I went to a very ordinary comprehensive school, And I thought writing was one of those things that sort of posh people did, like being a polar explorer or a High Court judge, or, you know, I didn't think that that was for me, not for the likes of me. And then I worked as a nanny for somebody who got published, and I also, my brother-in-law's best friend got published, and I suddenly realised, oh, and I knew, you know, I knew these people, I knew they weren't any cleverer or better than me. They were nice people who liked writing, and I thought, well, if they can do it, maybe I can do it. But I didn't actually start writing until I was in my properly. I was a freelance journalist for a while, but I didn't start writing properly until I had my kids in my 30s, really. I think sometimes there are jobs, aren't there, that you think, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that. And then you have a go and you think, oh yeah, actually, I could. It's quite nice. How do you celebrate when you finish a book? Oh, I don't know. Well, I don't know. We just have a cup of tea and a chocolate biscuit. My life's not that exciting. I might go out for a drink with my husband, an old-fashioned. Why does World War II remain an enduring fascination for our cultural life? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We're a bit obsessed with it, and I think even more so than World War I, but I think that's because it touched everyone's lives. It wasn't just a war undertaken remotely by the military. Everyone was affected somehow or other. So my mum was alive she was a very little girl, but she was alive in World War II. And so until the age of 5, she grew up living with her mum and her auntie and never seeing her dad, just because he was off doing war work somewhere. And she remembers rationing, and, you know, so even in very small ways, she was affected, and everybody would have been affected. Everybody would have known somebody who'd lost somebody, or it's a bit like the pandemic in that regard. Everybody somehow or other would have been affected by it, and I think that's why it still remains in our consciousness. And we were often nowadays, we're divided over issues, aren't we? People very divided over, I don't know, Brexit or stuff. But it was a very unifying time. We were all on the same side. We all had this common enemy. And so I think that's why it sort of, people hang on to it as a time when we were unified as a country, and we weren't racked with division over other things. What advice would you give to a newbie writer, apart from saying give up your day job? Keep going, just keep at it, and realise that you can write in very small, you know, don't think, oh, I have to wait for inspiration to strike, or I need a full day to write it. You can use little tiny snippets of time and still progress your novel. When I first started, I used to write after I put the kids to bed. I managed to do a master's when I was living on my own. My husband was in Afghanistan. I had 3 kids at home and a dog who was dying, bless him. And I still managed to write. So I think you just have to find the time and don't be too precious about it. Realise that the first book you write will probably be rubbish and will never get published, and keep going and write your second book, your third book, your fourth book. And just don't stop. You know, you'll get there in the end. And even if you don't get there, you will have lived your life the way you want to. So yeah, keep going with it. Do you ever want to go back to the stories of any of your characters and tell their continuing stories? Kind of. I think what I did do with the first book that I wrote, The Gunner Girl, I did take some of the characters on and give them their own. So Edie, who was a character in The Gunner Girl, got her own book with The Escape, which was my second book, because I thought, oh, there's a bit more to her, and I wanted to give her own story. And then also in The Gunner Girl, there was a sort of cameo character who was a sister of one of the characters called Vi, and I thought, well, I just quite like Vi. And so I took her and she's one of the main characters in The Night Raid. But carrying on and writing about them afterwards, I don't know. I'd rather like to think that they live happily ever after, or not sometimes. But who knows, might go back to them. But there are other stories to be told. So, oh, that's it, I think.
I think that's, yeah.
Any more
If there are no more questions, then I think it's a lovely point to finish. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk, and thank all these photos as well, which is fascinating.